Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we're going to take a look at the AG42 Ljungman. This is Sweden's first semi-auto infantry rifle, adopted and manufactured right smack in the middle of World War II. Not a particularly common thing among countries that weren't like massive military powers active in the war. Now, the Swedes decided that they wanted to get in on the semi-auto military rifle thing, and first off, in 1938, one of the engineers at the Carl Gustafstad's rifle factory makes an attempt to convert Swedish bolt-action Mausers to semi-auto. And it doesn't go well. Like, as one would expect, there are a lot of attempts to do that sort of thing, usually a bit earlier than like 1938, but there are a lot of attempts, they never really work that well, and this was no exception. So instead, Sweden starts holding some rifle trials, and there are two finalists. One of them is the Ljungman rifle here, and the other is the Finnish Pelo system, designed by Finnish Captain Pelo, who worked for Sacco at the time. If you're interested in these, by the way, I do actually have a video on a later pattern Pelo that you can check out, and I'll link to that in the description text. At any rate, the Ljungman here is designed by one Erik Eklund, who worked for a Swedish company in Malmö called Ljungmans Verkstäder. And this wasn't a company that had any small arms design experience or manufacturing experience. They were a company that actually made gas pumps, like the big pumping stations that you have at gas stations. That was their specialty. But Wahlberg decides to get in on this, and his focus in designing the rifle is to make it as simple as possible, which is not a bad way to go. There are a lot of early semi-auto rifles that really suffer from being much too complex. The Ljungman is definitely not it. And in fact, what gets this rifle adopted by the Swedish testing committee is its very simple nature. So in August of 1941, they formally decide on the Ljungman as the winner of the trials, and then it's formally adopted as the Automatgewehr, or automatic rifle M42, on December 5th, 1941. The rifle is then going to go into production. There were some issues in production, but we'll talk about that in a minute. First, let's take a closer look at this. We'll pull it apart. Let me show you just how simple it really is, and why it is far worse than the M1 Garand for eating your thumb. Quick look at the markings here. We have a crown over C that indicates these were manufactured by the government-owned arsenal at Carl Gustafstad. Date of production, and there are only three dates that you'll find: 1943, 1945, and 1955. We'll get to that in a moment. 1943 dates run up until the middle of about the 23,000 range. This is the date when the receiver was manufactured. Not like the rifles, we'll touch on this as well, but the rifles weren't really delivered until 44, but most of them, about 2/3 of them, are dated 1943. You will also find 1945s, and the serial number range goes up into, well, the highest one that I've been able to find myself is 32,203. So a little over 32,000 of these manufactured in total. And the vast majority of them were manufactured by the end of World War II. 1945 is essentially the last production date. Here's a quick example of 1955 production date. So obviously you've got the date there. They continued the existing serial number range. They only made a couple hundred of these guys, and what they did was just tack a 1 in front of the existing, the previously defined serial number range. So instead of this being 32,037, it's 132,037. And these were manufactured while the arsenal was doing an upgrade package on the existing guns, which we'll talk about in a moment. And these were apparently, I think, made from parts. They were sort of like additional leftover / backup or replacement rifles. These are really quite rare. There's only a couple hundred of them ever made, but since we have one here, I thought it'd be cool to show you. The one other marking that you'll find on these is SS on the front right of the receiver. This does not mean these were used by the SS. Ljungman rifles were in fact not used by the German SS. These are the initials of the inspector at Carl Gustafstad who approved the rifles. He was Captain Sten Stamno, hence the SS. And I think he was the inspector for the entire production run. All right, as a basic overview, the AG42 Ljungman is a semi-auto rifle. It uses a direct gas impingement system, which is pretty cool. It's one of only a handful of guns that use that sort of system. It has a 10-round detachable magazine, although it was not intended It was not issued with spare magazines, and it was really intended to be loaded by stripper clip, so 5-round stripper clips. It is chambered for the standard Swedish 6.5 by 55 millimeter cartridge, uses a tilting bolt locking system, and has a very unusual operating action. Looking at this and knowing that the guy who designed it had no prior weapons design experience kind of helps, I think, helps one understand why it was designed this way. So the way this works is you have the bolt here and you have a bolt cover here. And to cock it, you grab this, you've got 2 little serrated grasping pads, and you're going to push this forward all the way like that. When it's all the way forward, this locks onto the bolt. And then when you pull it backwards, that, by the way, is our hammer right there, which we're recocking in the process. Now, the action is open. You have a stripper clip guide right here. You can reload the magazine with 10 new rounds, and the magazine locks this thing open. Now, one quick interlude here. This rifle seems to have a modified magazine release, and I don't know why. One of the original complaints about the AG42 was that it was really easy to lose the magazines, to drop them accidentally, and that's because as it was originally designed, the AG42 had a magazine release like this. So this is something they would fix later. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But this example, they appear to have fixed that problem in a sort of, well, not temporary, but a non-standard way by giving it this, by basically cutting down the magazine release lever to make it very difficult to get the magazine out. But I need to in order to show you how it works. So we're gonna, all right, so there is the magazine, 10 rounds. There's your hold open tab on the follower. Now, in real practice, you would load the magazine, that pushes the follower tab down, undoes, like releases the bolt hold open, and then to close the bolt, what you do is pull this forward just a hair until it clicks, and now you can see it's sitting slightly forward here. When I push it back, it's going to release the bolt, and the recoil spring that is currently compressed in here is going to let that bolt slam forward, like that. And it is really easy, if you're not really familiar with this rifle, to get your thumb in the way, and holy cow, that's way worse than Garand thumb. So there is a safety back here as well that I'll point out. So if we do this again, like every time, if I don't have a magazine in there to lock the bolt open, as soon as this hits the back, it releases the bolt. Now, if I engage the safety right there, flip it over to the right for safe, that deactivates that feature. So as long as it's on safe, it's not going to bite your finger. But once we push it back, now it's spring-loaded and dangerous. Now let's move up to the front for a moment. We have a series of muzzle brake holes drilled into the front of the barrel. That was standard on all the rifles, kind of cool. We have our front sight there, square front post. The whole front sight is adjustable for windage. The cleaning rod on the Ljungman is rather cool. So it screws into the front lug here. There was a bayonet for these. They took the same standard bayonet as the regular Swedish Mausers. So the cleaning rod threads into the nose cap up here, but it's also threaded back here, and that's because you actually have a full-length 2-part cleaning rod where the second half is actually nested inside the first half. So you unscrew this, pull it out, flip it around, and screw it back in, and now you have a full-length rod to use. There's the slot for your cleaning patch right there. And slide them back together, and presto, you've got a nice compact cleaning rod now. All right, the rear sight is just a U-notch, and it's got a little window here. This dial changes your elevation. You can see it going up there. And 1941, when the Ljungman was adopted, was the exact same year that Sweden adopted a Spitzer bullet. So before that, they had 157 grained round nose standard projectile for the cartridge. In 1941, they adopt a 140 grain pointed Spitzer round. It's flatter shooting, better trajectory. But when this rifle is being adopted, there's still a lot of both type, well, there's a lot of the old round nose ammunition in inventory. So they want a way to have this sighted optionally for both cartridges. So this is currently set up for Spitzer. You can see the little bullet logo there. It's pointed. And then we've got our ranges in hundreds of meters in the little window. So with Spitzer, this can go from 100 out to 700 meters. Now, let me pull off the handguard and I can show you how to change that to round nose. So I just need to take off the front barrel band here. There we go, we'll pull the barrel band forward. Then I can slide the handguard off. That's your gas block and gas tube. We'll talk about that in a moment. But if I come up here to the rear sight, I can pop out this little wire clip right here. Then I can lift out the knob. And inside I have this. This is what actually determines the sight holdovers. And we have on this side the pointed Spitzer bullet logo, and on this side we have the round-nosed bullet logo. So I can take this and just rotate it 180 degrees, put it back in, and then I will be reading these graduations. And if we look at the sight drum, you can see we have two rows of numbers, one on the outside and one on the inside. Those correspond to the two different windows for the different types of bullet. So there's a detent right here, and that's going to drop into these holes, and that's what gives you your elevation settings. So the ones that are really close together are the Spitzer bullet ones. The ones that are farther apart are the round-nosed bullet ones. So all I have to do is drop that in. The rear sight knob itself has this offset round lug, which is only going to fit in the correct orientation here, so I don't have to worry about aligning it. I just put that in and rotate it until it drops into place, and then a little wire clip goes back in, and now I've got round nose range markings. Those only go out to 600 because it is not as flat shooting of a cartridge as the pointed bullets. All right, moving on to the rest of disassembly. I don't want to disassemble this. Well, you could disassemble this with the bolt locked up inside the bolt carrier here, but I don't want that to basically explode on me once it's out of the gun. So I've taken the safety off. I'm going to drop the bolt like that. Then disassembly just requires pulling the cover forward, move the selector, the safety lever to the very middle, and then this rear lug lifts right out of the gun. And then the bolt cover slides off the back. You can see we have a two-part recoil spring inside here. So there's a connecting guide rod in the middle. This lug, this spring right here, this hook, is what actually locks the bolt into that bolt cover. So I can now pull the bolt out, the bolt carrier out. This has a tilting bolt, so that's the traveling position. That's the locked position. That surface right there is your locking surface, which locks against this nice shiny locking lug right there, locking block in the receiver. That's a different color, by the way, because it's a different material with a different heat treat, because you want it to be particularly hardened differently than you want the rest of the receiver. You'll note this has a -2. These can be interchanged to address potential issues with headspace over time, so kind of cool. As I mentioned earlier, the rifle is hammer fired, so there's the hammer in the cocked position. I'm not going to take that out. There's not a whole lot to go around to show you there. I can pull the bolt out of the bolt carrier. Also, pretty simple, spring-loaded firing pin in the back. That's kind of all you got going on there. The way that this bolt system works to allow the bolt cover here to catch the bolt is this hook right there locks into this little lug in the back of the bolt. So I can't really show you that without actually compressing the spring inside, but when you pull this back, it's going to hit the rear lug, this guy, which pushes it up, which releases the bolt. Note that when the safety is in the fire position. This round piece protrudes, and you can see the shiny spot where it's been hitting that catch to release the bolt. When it's in safe, this is recessed, so there's nothing for this lug to hit, and that's why it doesn't release the bolt in safe. In terms of operation, it's a very simple direct gas impingement system. Gas block is here with a hollow tube, very similar to an AR's gas tube, that's going to come back. It's fixed in the receiver here and just ends in that open, it's not a piston, it's just an open tube. That tube nests into this cup. Again, it's not a piston because there's no gas sealing mechanism. There are no rings. There's no pressure actually built up in here. It's just a function of gas being blown into that cup that pushes the bolt carrier back and causes the gun to cycle. So very simple system. And this actually led to one of the other long-term, basically unsolvable problems with the rifle, is because the gas tube was fixed to the receiver and to the barrel, the Swedes found that when the barrels got hot, they couldn't float properly. The barrels would start well, your shooting would go dramatically downhill. These were typically on the order of 3 to maybe 4 MOA rifles, pretty typical for service rifles of the period. When they got hot, you could get as bad as like 14 MOA, which was indeed pretty bad. Note that unlike this, the AR, which doesn't suffer from this sort of accuracy problem because of its DI system, on the AR, the gas tube isn't fixed in the receiver like this, it's actually floating, so you have the ability for the gas tube to move slightly in the AR. All right, and there is the original AG42 Ljungman field stripped. I should point out also, these were issued like to the infantry squad. They didn't try to equip complete units with Ljungman semi-auto rifles. They used them to supplement Mausers in infantry units. So production begins in 1942, but it really takes some time to spin up. And this, by the way, is not being produced at the Ljungman gas pump factory. They get to design it. They don't get the chance to actually manufacture it. The manufacturing is all done by the official state arsenal in Eskilstuna, the Carl Gustafstad arsenal factory. So they take some time to get spun up. There are some material problems. Probably the biggest one is the material for extractors. They're having a lot of problems in initial development with extractors breaking way too early. Turns out they were getting bad steel for them. They solved that problem, but ultimately it's basically the beginning of 1944 before rifle deliveries really begin in earnest. As you saw, the guns are mostly marked 1943. That's when the receivers were manufactured. Complete gun deliveries really start in early 1944. So there would then be a significant refurbishment program, an almost universal refurbishment program in 1953, where they wanted to address a bunch of issues with the guns. So we're going to cover that upgrade. That becomes the AG42B. We're going to cover that in a separate video because there's a lot of stuff actually to go over there. And I wanted to keep the original rifle as its own separate standalone video, in part because these things are so very, very scarce to find today. Virtually all of the guns were updated by the Swedes in the 1950s. They would stay in service into at least the 1970s, with some limited use decades after that even. They stayed in, I think the last Swedish infantry manual that they were in was 1970. In 1964-65, the Swedes adopt a replacement for this, and that is the AK4. It is a slight Swedish variation on the HK-G3s. So AK4 development and adoption is its own separate set of videos. There were a number of attempts to upgrade or modernize the AG42 to compete with the G3s in trials. We'll cover those in a separate couple of videos as well. So hopefully you enjoyed this one. Like I said, finding an original AG42 that hasn't been upgraded is a very difficult thing to do. So very cool to get a chance to take a look at this one. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.